Doctor had seen many strange things during his 47 years but nothing had prepared him for the sight that greeted him on the frozen moon of 7. 6 young females of the wolf species huddled together in the ruins of what had once been a magnificent library, their silver fur matted with ice, and their amber eyes wide with terror. They were a proud species, known throughout the galaxy for their fierce independence and pack mentality. These girls, however, were clearly outcasts. Their ears were clipped in the traditional mark of exile, and their bodies bore the ritual scars that marked them as failures in their society's brutal coming-of-age trials. Had come to 7 following ancient star charts that suggested the presence of a lost human archive from the early expansion period, over 3,000 years ago. What he found instead was a dying civilization's last gasps and 6 terrified young beings who needed help more than he needed another academic discovery. The eldest of the group, who couldn't have been more than 16 in human years, stepped forward when she noticed approaching. Her name was Lyra, and despite her youth, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of noble blood fallen on hard times. The others clustered behind her, their names whispered in the ancient tongue: Nyx, Luna, Stella, and little Iris, who couldn't have been older than 12. "Human," Lyra said in broken galactic standard, her voice trembling from both cold and fear. "You should not be here. The Matriarch comes soon." Set down his research equipment and pulled emergency thermal blankets from his pack. The girls flinched at first, but hunger and cold won out over caution. As he distributed food rations and activated portable heaters, their story began to unfold. They had been cast out 3 months ago when they failed the trial of the Blood Moon, a savage ritual that required young to hunt and kill a sentient being from another species to prove their worth as warriors. The 6 girls had refused, claiming that such violence went against the old ways their ancestors had followed before the Matriarch's rise to power. The current Matriarch, a massive female named Hatha, had transformed society from one of honor and wisdom into a cult of brutality. Under her rule, the ancient libraries were burned, scholars were executed, and only the strongest and most vicious were allowed to survive. The 6 girls represented the last remnant of the old scholarly class, their families all dead or enslaved. Learned that the ruins they sheltered in were actually part of the very human archive he had come seeking. They had been the keepers of human knowledge for preserving texts and technologies that had been lost to time. The irony was not lost on him that these refugees were the last guardians of his own species' forgotten history. As the girls recovered their strength, began to understand the true scope of what they faced, the Matriarch wasn't just a local tyrant. She was part of a larger movement sweeping across this sector of the galaxy. Warrior cults were rising everywhere, destroying the delicate balance of knowledge and cooperation that had allowed diverse species to coexist for thousands of years. The girls showed him deeper into the ruins, revealing chambers filled with crystalline data storage devices containing human literature, scientific theories, and philosophical works that predated the formation of the current Galactic Council. The knowledge here was invaluable, representing a lost golden age of human intellectual achievement. But as worked to catalog and preserve what he could, Lyra brought him devastating news. Scout ships had been spotted in the outer system. The Matriarch had found them. Hatha commanded a fleet of 20 warships and over 10,000 warriors. She had spent months tracking the 6 exiles, not because they posed any military threat, but because their very existence challenged her authority. As long as they lived, some might remember that there had once been another way. Faced an impossible choice. His research ship, the Meridian, was fast but lightly armed. He could evacuate maybe 2 of the girls before the fleet arrived, but that would mean abandoning the others and the archive to certain destruction. The scholar in him understood the cosmic importance of preserving the knowledge, but the human in him couldn't leave children to die. The girls seemed to sense his dilemma. They gathered around the central chamber where the most important crystals were stored, their young faces grave with a wisdom beyond their years. Lyra spoke for all of them when she told that they would rather die protecting the archive than live knowing they had betrayed their ancestors' trust. It was then that made a decision that would echo across the galaxy. He began uploading the archive's contents to every database and communication network he could access, broadcasting 3,000 years of human knowledge to anyone willing to receive it. If the Matriarch wanted to destroy this place, she would have to destroy the entire galactic communication grid to stop the spread of information. The uploads would take 72 hours to complete. The Matriarch's fleet would arrive in 48. Spent the next day teaching the girls everything he could about human history and culture, preparing them for what was to come. They proved to be remarkably quick learners, absorbing concepts that had taken human scholars decades to develop. He began to understand why their ancestors had been chosen as keepers of human knowledge. As night fell on the second day, long-range sensors detected the approaching fleet. 20 massive warships, each bristling with weapons and carrying hundreds of bloodthirsty warriors. At their head flew the Matriarch's flagship, a monstrous vessel called the Bone Crusher that had been built from the wreckage of conquered worlds. Powered up his ship's defensive systems, knowing they would provide little protection against such overwhelming force. The girls gathered in the central chamber, surrounding the crystalline archive like an honor guard. They had painted their faces with ancient symbols and donned the ceremonial robes of their ancestors, choosing to meet death as scholars rather than exiles. The first bombardment began at dawn. The Matriarch's ships opened fire on the ruins, their plasma cannons turning stone to molten glass. But the ancient human construction proved surprisingly resilient, the walls holding against the initial assault. The archive's location deep underground provided additional protection, though the chamber shook with each impact. Through the comm channels, Ha's voice boomed across the battlefield. She demanded the immediate surrender of the 6 exiles, promising them quick deaths if they. When no response came, she ordered her warriors to prepare for ground assault. Watched through his ship's sensors as thousands of warriors descended from orbit in drop pods, their howls of bloodlust echoing across the frozen landscape. They were massive creatures, standing over 7 feet tall with claws that could tear through steel and fangs that could crush bone. Each one was a veteran of countless battles, hardened by years of conquest and slaughter. But as the warriors advanced on the ruins, something unexpected happened. The upload of the human archive reached a critical milestone, and across the galaxy, scholars and peaceful beings began to receive fragments of the ancient knowledge. They learned of human concepts like democracy, scientific method, and universal rights. They read human poetry that spoke of love transcending species barriers and human philosophy that argued for the dignity of all sentient life. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Peaceful species that had been cowed into submission by the rising warrior cults suddenly found their voices. Scientists who had been forced to develop weapons began broadcasting equations for healing instead. Artists who had been silenced began creating works that celebrated diversity rather than conquest. The Matriarch's own communication networks became flooded with this new wave of information, reaching even her most loyal warriors. Some began to question orders they had never questioned before. Others simply laid down their weapons, overwhelmed by concepts they had never been taught to consider. But Ha herself was unmoved. She had built her power on the systematic destruction of such weakness, and she knew that her own survival depended on crushing this last symbol of the old ways. As her warriors hesitated, she took personal command of the assault, her massive form leading the charge toward the archive's entrance. Knew that the final confrontation was at hand. The upload was only 60% complete, but the Matriarch would not wait any longer. He checked his weapons one last time and prepared to make his stand alongside 6 young aliens who had become his students, his friends, and perhaps the most important discovery of his career. The ancient human archive trembled as footsteps approached, and somewhere in the darkness, Hatha began to laugh. The entrance to the archive exploded inward as Hatha made her dramatic arrival. She stood nearly 9 feet tall, her silver fur streaked with the black markings of ritual scarification. Ancient bone trophies hung from her armor, each one representing a species she had personally driven to extinction. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural red light, the result of combat stimulants that had long since altered her brain chemistry. Behind her came her elite guard, the Fang Reapers, each one chosen for their absolute loyalty and complete lack of conscience. They had fought alongside their matriarch for decades, participating in the conquest of 17 worlds and the systematic elimination of anyone who opposed the new warrior code. Stood between the advancing warriors and the 6 girls, his research equipment hastily converted into makeshift weapons. A plasma cutter designed for archaeological excavation hummed in his hands, while various sensors and probes had been rigged with explosive charges. It wasn't much against an army, but it was what he had. So, Ha's voice boomed through the chamber, each word dripping with contempt. The mighty human scholar believes he can protect these weaklings. How amusing. She gestured to the crystalline archive surrounding them, its surfaces still glowing with the energy of active data transmission. Do you know what this place represents, human? It represents everything that was wrong with the old ways. Knowledge without strength. Wisdom without power. Your ancestors were fools to trust such precious things to keepers who lacked the will to defend them. Activated his translator and stepped forward, his voice steady despite the overwhelming odds. My ancestors trusted them because they understood something you've forgotten. True strength comes from cooperation, not conquest. Knowledge grows when it's shared, not when it's hoarded by tyrants. The matriarch's laugh was like breaking glass. Pretty words from a dead man. Tell me, scholar, how much do you know about your own species' history? Do you know why humans really disappeared from this sector 3,000 years ago? The question caught off guard. Standard historical records suggested that early human colonies had been abandoned due to resource depletion and political instability. But the way Ha spoke suggested a different truth. They ran, she continued, clearly enjoying his confusion. When faced with the first warrior uprising, when the empire began its expansion, your people gathered up their precious books and fled rather than fight. They left these moon dogs to guard their treasures because they were too cowardly to stay and defend them themselves. Lyra stepped forward from behind, her young voice carrying surprising authority. You lie, Matriarch. The humans didn't flee. They sacrificed themselves to stop the advance. My grandmother told me the stories her grandmother told her. 3 human fleets held the line at the Nexus gates for 6 months, fighting to the last ship so that the peaceful worlds could evacuate. Stories, Ha spat. Lies told by the weak to make themselves feel better about serving cowards. But was studying the archive's displays, watching as more and more data flowed out into the galaxy. Among the transmitted files were military records, tactical analyses, and battle reports that told a different story than either the official histories or Ha's propaganda. The truth, as always, was more complex than anyone had imagined. The early human colonies hadn't fled the warrior uprising. They had been systematically hunted down and destroyed by it. But before their fall, they had managed to hide copies of their greatest achievements with trusted allies like The archive on 7 wasn't just a library. It was a time capsule, meant to preserve human knowledge until a time when it could safely resurface. That time had apparently come. Across the galaxy, the transmitted data was being received by species who had forgotten that alternatives to conquest existed. Peaceful civilizations that had been cowering in fear for generations suddenly remembered that they outnumbered the warrior cults by millions to one. Ha sensed the shift in galactic mood through her own communication networks. Reports were flooding in of uprisings on occupied worlds, of warrior fleets deserting of entire sectors declaring independence from the various tyrants who had claimed dominion over them. The careful balance of terror she had helped maintain was crumbling. Enough, she roared, raising her massive claws. I'll kill you all myself and scatter these crystals across the void. Let the galaxy have its pretty words. Words won't save them when my fleets burn their worlds to ash. She lunged forward with inhuman speed, her claws aimed at its throat. But the human scholar had spent decades studying alien combat techniques, and his archaeological work had given him reflexes honed by years of dangerous excavations. He rolled aside, bringing up the plasma cutter in a defensive arc that forced the matriarch to adjust her attack. The beam caught her across the shoulder, burning through her armor and drawing first blood. Ha howled in pain and rage, spinning to face him with murder in her glowing eyes. No one had injured her in personal combat for over 20 years. Around them, the Fang Reapers moved to surround and the girls. But as they advanced, something unexpected happened. The 6 young stepped forward as one, placing themselves between the warriors and the archive. They had no weapons, no armor, no training in combat. But they had something their opponents had long forgotten, absolute belief in what they were defending. Spoke first, her voice clear and strong. We are the daughters of Keeper Ra, who died protecting the learning stones of Vega Prime. We stand in her place. Nyx joined her sister. We are the daughters of I, who chose exile rather than burn the books of memory. We stand in his place. One by one, each girl declared her lineage, naming ancestors who had died defending knowledge and wisdom against the forces of ignorance and brutality. Their words carried power in the old tongue, invoking ancient laws and traditions that even the Fang Reapers remembered from their youth. Some of the warriors actually stepped back, their conditioning warring with deeply buried memories of honor and duty. These girls represented bloodlines that had once commanded respect throughout society. To kill them would be to sever the last links to their people's noble past. But Ha had no patience for such sentiment. "Kill them all," she commanded. "I'll not have my empire undermined by the ghosts of failures." The first Fang Reaper to advance on Little Iris found himself facing not a helpless child, but wielding a plasma cutter with surgical precision. The beam took off the warrior's weapon hand at the wrist, and he fell back howling. The second attacker managed to close within claw range before improvised explosives turned him into scattered. The scholar fought with a fury that surprised even himself. These weren't just alien children he was protecting. They were the living embodiment of everything he had dedicated his life to preserving. Knowledge, wisdom, the careful cultivation of understanding between species, the belief that intelligence and cooperation could triumph over brute force and ignorance. Each fallen warrior bought more time for the upload to continue. 75% complete, 80%. The archive's crystals pulsed with increasing brightness as of carefully preserved human achievement flooded out into a galaxy that had almost forgotten such things were possible. Ha herself joined the battle, her massive form moving with deadly grace as she sought to corner. Her claws could shred steel, and her speed was almost supernatural, but had advantages she didn't expect. His archaeological tools included gravity manipulators designed for moving massive stones, and his years of fieldwork had taught him to use his environment as a weapon. When the Matriarch lunged for him again, triggered a resonance pulse in the crystal formations surrounding them. The entire chamber rang like a bell, the harmonic vibrations disrupting Ha's enhanced senses and sending her staggering into a wall. "Impossible," she snarled, shaking her massive head to clear it. "No human possesses such knowledge. Your species died out centuries before these techniques were developed." Smiled grimly as he backed toward the central archive cluster, the girls forming a protective circle around the most crucial data crystals. "That's where you're wrong, Matriarch. My people didn't die out. We scattered, we adapted, we learned, and we never ever forgot our friends." The upload meter hit 90% just as Ha's reinforcements burst through the damaged entrance. Fresh warriors, hungry for blood and glory, filled the chamber with their howls. Counted at least 30 of them, more than enough to overwhelm his dwindling defenses. But as the new arrivals spread out to surround the archive, their communications equipment began broadcasting something that made them pause. Across the galaxy, the transmitted human knowledge was sparking a renaissance of thought and creativity. Scientists were announcing breakthrough discoveries based on ancient human theories. Artists were creating works that celebrated the diversity of galactic civilization. Most importantly, peaceful species were remembering that they had strength in numbers. The warrior empire that Ha had helped build was collapsing not under military assault, but under the weight of ideas. Ideas about justice, cooperation, scientific inquiry, and the inherent dignity of all sentient life. Ideas that had been preserved for 3,000 years by 6 young refugees in the ruins of a forgotten library. As the upload counter hit 95%, made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He activated the plasma cutter's overload sequence, turning it into a makeshift bomb with enough power to bring down the entire chamber. If Ha wanted to destroy the archive, she would have to accept that her own death was the price. "Choose," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "You can kill us all and destroy this place, but the knowledge is already out there. The galaxy has remembered what you tried to make it forget. Or you can walk away and spend what time you have left watching your empire crumble under the weight of its own contradictions." Ha's red eyes blazed with fury, but beneath the rage could see something else. Fear. For the first time in decades, the Matriarch was facing an enemy she couldn't simply tear apart with claws and fangs. She was facing the power of ideas, and ideas were stronger than any weapon she possessed. The upload counter hit 98%, 99%, 100%. Across the galaxy, 3,000 years of human knowledge spread like wildfire through every database, every communication network, every thinking mind capable of understanding it. The Renaissance had begun. The silence in the archive chamber stretched for what felt like an eternity. Ha stood motionless, her massive form trembling with barely contained rage as reports flooded in through her neural implants. 300 worlds had declared independence in the past hour. 17 of her fleet commanders had switched sides. The Empire's successor states were fragmenting as their own populations turned against them. Kept his finger on the plasma cutter's detonation switch, knowing that even the smallest twitch would end all their lives. But he could see something changing in the Matriarch's expression. The blind fury was giving way to a calculating intelligence that was somehow even more dangerous. "You think you've won?" she said finally, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think spreading your pretty words will make the galaxy safe for weaklings and cowards, but ideas without strength to back them are just noise. When the initial excitement fades, when reality sets in, your admirers will remember why the strong rule and the weak serve." Lyra stepped forward, no longer the terrified exile, but something approaching the noble scholar she had been born to be. "You're wrong, Matriarch. The ancient ways didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because people like you convinced others that brutality was strength. But true strength is what we've shown here today. True strength is choosing to preserve rather than destroy, to teach rather than conquer, to protect rather than exploit." The young's words carried weight beyond her years, and could see them affecting even the Fang Reapers. These warriors had been raised on stories of the old honor codes, even if they had been taught to despise them. Hearing those values spoken with such conviction by one so young stirred memories they had tried to bury. But Ha was not moved. If anything, Lyra's defiance seemed to amuse her. "Child, you speak of strength you've never tested. Tell me, what will you do when I order my warriors to slowly dismember your friends while you watch? What will you do when I promise to hunt down every scholar, every teacher, every gentle soul inspired by your human knowledge? Will your precious principles comfort you as the galaxy burns?" The threat was not an idle one. Even with her empire crumbling, Ha still commanded thousands of fanatically loyal warriors scattered across dozens of worlds. She could spend years conducting a campaign of terror against anyone who embraced the newly released knowledge. The Renaissance had started could die in blood and screaming. It was then that something unexpected happened. The archive's crystals began to pulse with a new rhythm, one that none of them had seen before. Deep within the data matrices, automatic systems were activating protocols that had been dormant for 3. The human architects of this place had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. Felt his research equipment linking with the archive's quantum processors, downloading information directly into his neural implants. Maps, coordinates, locations of other hidden caches scattered across the galaxy. But more than that, he was receiving tactical data, strategic analyses, and military technologies that the ancient humans had developed during their final war against the first warrior uprising. The revelation staggered him. The humans hadn't simply preserved their culture and knowledge. They had prepared for its eventual return. Every piece of technology in the archive, every carefully preserved text, every philosophical treatise, was part of a vast plan to ensure that when their ideals resurfaced, they would have the tools necessary to defend themselves. Across the galaxy, other archives were awakening. On VII, automated factories began producing medical equipment based on human designs. On New Geneva, defensive satellites that had been disguised as asteroids for 3,000 years came online. On dozens of peaceful worlds, ordinary citizens found themselves with access to technologies that could level the playing field against their oppressors. Ha felt the shift through her own intelligence networks. The scattered reports were almost too incredible to believe. Ancient human warships, preserved in hidden bases, were launching themselves toward strategic positions. Defensive systems were materializing around vulnerable worlds. Most shocking of all, peaceful species were demonstrating military capabilities they had never shown before. "Impossible," she breathed, her red eyes wide with something approaching panic. The humans were pacifists, philosophers. They never developed serious military technology. Smiled as the data continued to flow into his mind. The true scope of his ancestors' plan was breathtaking in its complexity. They developed it because they had to, because they knew that eventually someone like you would force them to choose between extinction and resistance. They chose resistance, but they were smart enough to know they couldn't win the immediate fight, so they played a longer game. The 6 girls gathered closer around the archive's central core, their hands touching the crystal surfaces as information flowed between them and the ancient databases. They were receiving something different than, something specifically meant for their species. Training protocols, genetic activation sequences. The knowledge their ancestors had preserved was awakening dormant capabilities in their own bloodlines. Was the first to change. Her amber eyes began to glow with golden light as neural pathways that had been suppressed for generations came online. The ritual scars on her arms faded as cellular regeneration programs activated. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that hadn't been heard in living memory. "We remember," she said, and the words seemed to resonate through the crystal formations around them. "We remember who we were before the fear, before the hunger, before the matriarchs turned us into beasts." One by one, the other girls underwent similar transformations. Not physical changes, but a restoration of capabilities their people had possessed before centuries of warrior rule had bred them out of the population. They were becoming what they had been in the days when they walked between stars as teachers and guardians rather than conquerors and slaves. Ha watched these transformations with growing alarm. She had built her power on the systematic suppression of these very traits, convincing her people that their scholarly ancestors had been weaklings unfit to survive. But here was proof that the opposite was true. The ancient had been more than their descendants, not less. "Stop this," she commanded, raising her claws toward the nearest girl. "I am the matriarch. I am the apex of our evolution. You cannot undo what we have become." But as she moved to strike, she found her way blocked by something far more dangerous than a plasma cutter. The Archive's defensive systems, dormant for 3,000 years, recognized the threat and responded accordingly. Energy barriers sprang up around the girls, while gravitational fields pinned the Fang Reapers against the chamber walls. More importantly, the awakening archives across the galaxy had begun broadcasting something new. Not just human knowledge and philosophy, but the true history of the warrior cults. Records of their origins, their funding, their coordination. Evidence that the various, independent tyrants were actually part of a single, vast conspiracy to keep the galaxy's peaceful species divided and helpless. The revelation shattered the last foundations of Ha's power. Her own warriors could hear the broadcasts through their communication implants, learning that they had been pawns in a game far larger than they had imagined. Many began laying down their weapons immediately, overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. But some remained loyal, and Ha herself was far from defeated. As the Archive's defenses focused on protecting the girls, and she began working her way toward the chamber's main power coupling. If she couldn't kill them directly, she would bring down the entire facility and bury them under millions of tons of rubble. Saw her intentions and moved to intercept, but the matriarch was faster and stronger than any baseline human. Her claws raked across his chest, opening wounds that would have been fatal without his suit's medical systems. He stumbled backward, his makeshift weapons scattered, as Ha reached the power coupling. "If I can't have an empire," she snarled, her claws crackling with energy as she prepared to tear out the facility's heart, "then no one can have your precious knowledge." It was Lyra who stopped her. The young had completed her transformation and now stood between the matriarch and her target. But she wasn't alone. Her 5 sisters flanked her, and together they represented something that hadn't existed for 3,000 years, a scholarly circle operating at full power. "You are not our matriarch," Lyra said, her voice carrying authority that seemed to resonate through the very bones of everyone present. "You are a pretender who seized power through murder and lies. By the ancient laws, by the codes our ancestors died to preserve, by the right of knowledge over ignorance, we strip you of all rank and title." The words shouldn't have had any power. They were just sounds, just ancient formulas from a discredited tradition. But as the 6 girls spoke them in unison, something fundamental shifted in the quantum structure of the chamber around them. The Archive's systems, designed by minds that understood the deep connections between information, consciousness, and reality itself, responded to properly invoked authority. Ha felt her enhanced abilities beginning to fail. The combat stimulants in her bloodstream neutralized themselves. The ritual scarifications that marked her rank began to fade. Most devastating of all, the neural programming that had shaped her thoughts for decades began to unravel, leaving her to confront the true magnitude of what she had done. For the first time in 40 years, Hatha remembered who she had been before the warrior cult recruited her. She remembered being the curious, a young scholar fascinated by xenobiology. She remembered choosing exile rather than participate in the first ritual killings. She remembered the slow corruption that had transformed her from a seeker of knowledge into an agent of destruction. The memory broke something fundamental inside her. She collapsed to her knees, her massive frame shaking as decades of suppressed conscience crashed down upon her. The bodies she had stepped over, the worlds she had helped burn, the countless young minds she had poisoned with her philosophy of strength through cruelty. Around the chamber, the Fang Reapers were undergoing similar revelations as their own programming failed. Some wept openly as they remembered the people they had been before the warrior cults took them. Others simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process the scope of their betrayal of their own values. Struggled to his feet, his wounds still bleeding despite his suit's best efforts. The archive around them was stabilizing as the awakened girls took their rightful places as its guardians. Across the galaxy, the Renaissance was accelerating as more hidden caches revealed themselves and more peaceful worlds found the courage to stand up to their oppressors. But perhaps most importantly, the warrior cults themselves were fragmenting as their rank and file soldiers remembered who they had been before fear and propaganda twisted them into instruments of oppression. The galaxy was healing, one awakened conscience at a time. Looked at the 6 girls who had become so much more than he could have imagined. They were no longer refugees or outcasts, but the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back to the stars themselves. They would carry forward the knowledge he had helped preserve, ensuring that future generations would never forget the lessons written in crystal and starlight. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing that the words were inadequate but needing to speak them anyway. Lyra smiled, her transformed features radiant with purpose. "Thank you, human scholar, for reminding us who we were meant to be." As the twin suns of 7 rose over the ancient archive, they illuminated a galaxy where tyranny was crumbling and hope was being reborn. The age of warriors was ending. The age of scholars had begun anew.